Great, thank you everyone. So this is going to be a kind of 3 for the price of 1 session, in that I'm going to talk about the presence of war in 3 of my books, The Missing of the Somme, Another Great Day at Sea, and most recently, Broadsword Calling Danny Boy, though I'll discuss them by order of conflict rather than year of publication. I was born in 1958, and in very different ways, the 2 world wars were all around. The First World War existed almost entirely in the realm of memory. Some of my strongest childhood memories are of other people remembering their experience of the First World War. So many times, for example, when I went round to my friend Gary Hunt's house, his granddad, after we'd been speaking to him for maybe 3 minutes, he'd drop his trousers. Not in any terrible way, but to show us the scars of his shrapnel wounds from the First World War. So there it was, a direct physical and fleshy connection with something that had occurred about 50 years earlier. I mean, all those years of his life spent in the aftermath of the most significant experience of his life. And consider that timescale for a moment. 50 years ago, I was saying, that's more than 20 years closer to the end of the First World War than we are now to the end of the Second. And at the heart of the First World War, if you're British, was the Battle of the Somme, that fateful day of the 1st of July 1916, with its 60,000 British and Empire casualties. And I first heard that word, the Somme, at home rather than school. That single mossy syllable expressed so much about loss, and I think about the pastness of the past. My grandfather fought at the Somme. The Somme and the First World War were where my family's history, unrecorded for the most part, consisting mainly of stories and little anecdotes. The Somme was the place where those stories intersected with the documentary record of huge historical events. But it was more complicated than that. Like many young men, my grandfather was underage when he turned up to enlist. And so the recruiting sergeant told him to come back in a couple of days when he was 2 years older. My grandfather duly returned, added a couple of years to his age, and was accepted into the army. Similar episodes are fairly common in the repertoire of recruitment stories, but I never really doubted the veracity of this particular version of it, which my mother told several times over the years. It came as a surprise then to discover, when he died, and I saw his death certificate, that my grandfather was born in November 1893, so he was 20 when the war broke out. One of the most commonly circulating stories of the 1914 generation had somehow been so thoroughly absorbed by my family that it had become part of my grandfather's autobiography. So what I'm saying is that the myth of the First World War was part of its reality, part of its memory, which was all-pervasive. And it works from the other side too, as it were. In 1998, the late John Keegan, one of our most respected military historians, he wrote, and I quote, "The Somme marked the end of an age of vital optimism in British life that has never been restored." Now, that's a very persuasive and, even in a way, quite seductive claim, one that appeals to a very British myth of decline, which turns out, like the story of my grandfather and the recruiting sergeant, to be at variance with the facts. I mean, think of 1966, when we beat the Germans for a 3rd time after extra time in the World Cup final at Wembley. Think of the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the explosion of ecstasy and rave culture seemed to be changing fundamentally the psychic makeup of what it meant to be young and British. Anyway, that aside, when I say the memory of the First World War was all-pervasive, I mean that quite literally, because in Britain, of course, every town and village has its war memorial. What a relief. The visual thing is working. The First World War formed an indelible part of the architecture and infrastructure of my childhood, or to be more precise, not the war, but the memory of the war. It wasn't just that there were memorials everywhere. This one is at Paddington Station, or this is a close-up of it, or here we have something from the Royal Artillery Memorial in London. The whole culture of remembering the First World War was everywhere. I mean, if we look at this, even the statues themselves seem to be remembering the First World War. Many of the components of memory were put in place at various times in the years immediately following the armistice. There's the here's another of these remembering statues. Here's a picture of the Temporary Cenotaph that was made permanent because it seemed to express such a deep need on the part of the public. There were the various parades. We'll just look at this picture for a moment. An extraordinary picture, partly because it's in colour, in 1919. But technologically, colour film required such a slow shutter speed that I think what you can see has happened, that it's basically the slow shutter speed has, if you like, vaporized the parade of soldiers. So we get this kind of huge river of absent people in the middle of the crowds, this kind of river of death, which of course speaks very symbolically of the many soldiers whose deaths were being commemorated. And, you know, many of the components of the project of commemoration were put in place throughout the 1920s. Here we have a very, I think, evocative photograph of what we might call the construction of memory. And it went on throughout the 1920s. But I think what's striking is that from a very early stage, poets and writers were obsessively worried about whether anyone would remember the First World War. They were convinced that it would be forgotten. "Have you forgotten yet?" asks Siegfried Sassoon in his poem Aftermath. And like many poets, Sassoon again and again lists all of the things that are in danger of being forgotten, thereby, of course, ensuring that they're fixed in our memory. That poem of his, Aftermath, is from 1919, so you think, okay, fair enough. But what's really odd is that people were obsessing over how the First World War would be remembered. More exactly, they were talking about the impossibility of remembering. They were doing this right from the start. And I'll give you a very vivid example of this. Every year on Armistice Day, or Veterans Day, as it's known here, at the various ceremonies they intone these words: "They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them." And with those incantatory rhythms and mantra-like repetitions, you know, we hear these words every year, but we rarely see them in print. It almost seems that they haven't been written. They've just kind of pulsed into life in the nation's collective memory, as though they've been generated down the long passage of years by the hypnotic spell of remembrance that they're used to induce. But of course, they're words, so they must have been written. They were written by Lawrence Binyon, but they weren't written in 1918 or 1919. Incredibly, they were written in September 1914. So this poem, called For the Fallen, was written before any of the fallen had had a chance to fall. In other words, it's a work not of remembrance, but of anticipation, or more accurately, the anticipation of remembrance. We will remember them. We are going to remember them. And of course, we still do. And so it comes to seem, with this all-pervasive culture of remembrance, it starts to seem, and of course I'm not a complete fool, I mean, I'm trying here to articulate an impression, it seems in a way that the war was maybe sort of fought in order that it might be remembered, that the scale of the conflict was such that it had to live up to the scale of its memory. And all of this, for me, came into focus when I visited the Thiepval Memorial in the department of the Somme, designed by Edwin Lutyens, who'd also designed the Cenotaph. And I visited this in the early 1990s, and I had this great revelation, a revelation so original, so profound that nobody had noticed this. I realized that the thing about the First World War is that it took place in the past. Sounds stupid. What I'm trying to say is there is this weird feeling that we got because of the weight of memory was such, it seems that it always took place in the past. I think this slightly daft idea will make sense if I compare it with the Second World War, which remains very much part of the present in a way. And I can bring this out, I think, by two pictures. Here's a photograph by Ernest Brooks taken during the First World War. It represents a kind of sort of self-enclosed ideal of remembrance. I mean, the sun is always going down on the First World War. Compare that with this famous Robert Capa from picture from D-Day. Now, in the Brooke photograph, what happens? Well, we're being urged to reflect on what has happened. Whereas in Capa, the action is swirling around us. It's ongoing, unstable. The outcome still hangs in the balance. Look at it, we wonder what's going to happen next. In fact, if the outcome hangs in the balance, that means that, in a sense, D-Day is still being fought over. And when I mentioned this picture in passing in an article in the New York Times, I got a furious response from someone explaining that an agreed-on version of what happened in this picture had in fact been overturned, that the famous blurring wasn't caused by a processing problem back in London. It was caused, this new version of events holds, by Capa himself at the very moment the picture was taken. Anyway, yes, the ever-presentness of the Second World War, it permeated every aspect of my childhood in the 1960s. As I said, I was born in 1958, which means I was a war child of sorts. Obviously, again, I'm not completely stupid. I'm aware that the actual war had been over with for 13 years by the time I was born. And, of course, a lot of old blokes who are in their 70s now often recall their childhoods spent playing in the actual in the bombed-out aftermath of the Blitz in London. By the way, when I say old blokes talking about their memories of playing around in the ruins of the Blitz, I mean people like Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. The whole of my childhood was dominated not by that reality of war, but its recreation in the culture, whereas those First World War memorials formed a kind of silent backdrop. The Second World War was the single most active component of my childhood. And I think I can bring out the scale of this quite literally by itemizing it quite precisely in terms of scale, starting with the smallest things, these 1/72 scale Airfix soldiers and planes, which I'm sure many of you made as well. Planes including this one, the Junkers Ju-52, which we'll come back to. Not just planes, but ships as well, like this aircraft carrier. And then, of course, we can move up a bit. There were slightly larger figures. These are about 2 inches high, so they're approximately 1/32 scale. And then, of course, as things get larger, we get 1/6 scale, so the figures are about 1 foot tall. This is Action Man, as it was called for us, G.I. Joe to you. And we all had our favorite outfits. Mine, and this will have some relevance shortly, was the Ski Patrol outfit. I think I had a special fondness for this because this was the nearest that my family and I ever got to going on a skiing holiday. And it didn't stop there. I mean, just as we could clothe our action men in the military uniforms and accessories of the Second World War, so we could clothe and equip ourselves with plastic tin hats, guns, and grenades. Here's a plastic grenade. Maybe it's because I'm an only child. I was always reluctant to throw a grenade like this because I was always worried that if I did, I wouldn't get it back. So much for play. Then there were the comics, the war and battle picture library things that dominated my childhood. There were so many of these. The covers were in color, but the contents were in black and white. Unlike the American ones, which of course, like our fighting forces, colour on the cover and inside. They were in colour throughout. It's a point that we'll return to shortly. We were immersed in the Second World War. Now, we conceived this war, entirely as us, the British and America, versus Germany and Japan. There was no Eastern Front at all, despite what you may have heard to the contrary from Anthony Beevor. Stalingrad didn't happen. Nor was my childhood war really about the Holocaust. These things, if you like, the Holocaust, the Eastern Front, they only happened later in the 1970s. I think it would be fair to say that for someone of my generation, we only became properly aware of these things with that great, still great actually, documentary series that came out, I think, in 1974, called The World at War. And that's when we gained a larger sense of what the Second World War really involved. And I think it's fair to say that in some ways, after that expansion, it could be said that in some ways it shrank in a way with a series like Ken Burns' The War or the Second World War in colour, with a distorting emphasis, I think, on the American war. In the case of the war in colour, the story and geography of the Second World War had to be reshaped according to what footage was available. And since, as was the case with those comics that we saw earlier, more of the American war was filmed in colour than was the case with poor old black and white Britain, so the atlas of the war, if you like, its projection, as they say, of maps, was altered by the technologies of narrative. Going back to the 1960s, the war of my childhood basically went like this: Dunkirk, the Battle of the Atlantic, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the Dam Busters, El Alamein, and then D-Day onwards. In the Pacific, Britain's role was essentially limited to terrible suffering as POWs at the hands of the Japanese. The fighting, of course, was done by the Americans on Iwo Jima and Okinawa and so forth. All of these theatres of war were represented in different ways by films, somewhat stoically and realistically by The Cruel Sea. You know, that great film, that wonderful moment, of course, when a cheery rating comes onto the bridge and says to Jack Hawkins, "More cocoa, sir?" And of course, at that exact moment, a torpedo slams into the back of the ship. Another sort of realistic film here, The Dam Busters, or on an epic scale, things like A Bridge Too Far. Two films which formed the foundation, if you like, for my subsequent interest in Anthony's book on Arnhem and Operation Market Garden. But even with filmed versions of the war, even if they were not firmly anchored in truth, they were in many ways accurate in terms of the period details. And all of these elements, toys, comics, films, sort of reinforced each other, so that a feature film like The Battle of Britain, this is a still from that film, what did that do? It verified the accuracy of the model planes I'd made, the planes which on Battle of Britain Day you still see flying in the skies above Britain. Those planes that we see in the skies of Britain, they are, if you like, one-to-one scale models. All of which I think makes that sequence at the end of the film Dunkirk. Here's another picture of a model. That sequence at the end of Dunkirk, when the Spitfire lands on the beach, it seems less like a representation of what actually happened than a fully immersive representation of what had been going on in my head, in our heads, for half a century. It's, if you like, an English dream of war. All of this, I suspect, was part of the many things churning away in the head of my ferocious, near-contemporary Johnny Rotten when he sang of England's dreaming. This is what boys of Rottens and my generation are dreaming of, partly when we think of England. As I say, alongside a fairly reliable film like The Battle of Britain, by the late 1960s there were more and more films which had elements of James Bond about them, sort of missions implausible that still looked real, like the toys we played with. And these also made the war look like, well, they made it look like a real lot of fun, actually. Never more so, of course, never more fun than when you're escaping from German POW camps. I mean, that really was a blast. You get the impression that escaping from these German holiday camps was so much fun that the prisoners were relieved at some level when they were captured and sent back, so they could try again, as happened repeatedly to Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, of course, always escaping, always getting sent back. Many of these films had elements of the caper about them. The biggest caper film of my childhood was The Italian Job, and these mission films, even including something like The Dirty Dozen, which is, of course, in some ways a thoroughly distasteful film, they might be collectively called things like the German jobs, as it were. And these German jobs often involved the Allies dressing up as Germans, as we see here. This is not a shot of a lone German scaling the white cliffs of Dover. It is, as you can see, the cover of the book that became a very successful film, written by Alistair MacLean, who went on to do the screenplay for the ultimate Second World War adventure, Where Eagles Dare. And that is the subject of my very latest book. Now, in some ways, it's a ludicrous film. It's got Richard Burton, Clint Eastwood, but a strange thing happens in that whenever I see Where Eagles Dare, I'm always completely caught up in it without having to make any allowances for it. It remains compelling, which is strange given that it's an action film with multiple plot twists, which I know off by heart. But in spite of that, I'm always caught up with it. Quite a few people, including the film director Catherine Bigelow, make the claim that action cinema is pure cinema. And it could be argued, I think, that Where Eagles Dare is a very pure defense of that claim. But it would be inappropriate, really, to be too solemn about this film. So what I did in this new book was offer a very close reading of this film in such a way that it contained the kind of response I had to it when I first saw it when I was 10 in 1969, a response that also had embedded in it, if you like, the changes in the way that I've come to regard it in the many years since I first saw it as a 10-year-old. So what I propose to do, and I really hope this will be fun, is I'm going to read a little bit of from the book as it relates to a certain sequence. It's impossible to be in real time throughout. I've edited the text for this talk, but although there'll be bits where my verbal version is completely in sync with what's going on screen, there'll be other bits where we lag behind or bounce ahead slightly. So a kind of Steve Reichian phasing will be going on. I should add also that maybe it's slightly different for an American audience, but this film is so embedded in the consciousness of every British kid that, for example, during the cover-up for the famous phone hacking scandal, they used one of the key phrases from the film, Broadsword Calling Danny Boy, as a way of communicating that they destroyed a certain amount of incriminating evidence. You don't need to bother too much about the plot of the film. What it involves really is they parachute in behind German lines, this group of Allied soldiers led by Eastwood and Burton. They disguise themselves as German soldiers, and we're going to pick it up where they go into town. And this is potentially going to happen. Thus arrayed, like any bunch of lads on the stag weekend, they head into the village of Werfen for a bit of the old après ski, minus the skiing. A little apprehensive, naturally, this being their first night out on the streets of the resort. The pitched roofs are laden with snow, the streets are bustling with troops and vehicles, and there's so much harping of horns it sounds like an alpine equivalent of Cairo. They choose a tavern at random. We'll try this one behind us, says Burton, though as with most things he says he's not saying, he's ordering them. He tells them to keep their ears open for anything about General Carnaby, though it seems a lame excuse for that which needs no excuse, namely getting into the bar and getting a few down them. It's a cosy place with foaming steins, a really festive Bavarian atmosphere, and no, obviously, anti-Semitic conversation. You can't help thinking what fun it would be to attend a fancy dress party like this in real life, even though you'd catch hell from the tabloids, especially since the guests include none other than the blonde beast, von Harpen, in his medal-bedecked Gestapo costume. For once, Burton is not the one doing the ordering. It's Eastwood who orders drinks at the bar, thereby raising the possibility that, for all his swagger, command, and much publicised love of drink and his willingness to splash out vast sums of money on diamonds, Burton might be that lowest, most treacherous form of British life, a round dodger, a conscientious drink-buying objector, an all-round round shirker. Even this suspicion only slightly clouds the rest of the group's belief that this is surely the best of all Second World War missions, way better than scaling the cliffs of Navarone or sweating your malarial bollocks off on that ghastly bridge over the River Kwai, or waiting for Telly Savalas to flip his sicko lid in the Dirty Dozen. A top night seems guaranteed as long as they can keep up their German and not be tricked into letting their conversational guard down, as fatally happened 6 years earlier to the actor Gordon Jackson as he boarded a bus in The Great Escape. This seems unlikely, since they are all, as we learned in the briefing, so fluent in German that it sounds indistinguishable from English. That fluency is casually conveyed by the way Eastwood asks for 2 beers, as though he's in a bar in Dodge City or Telluride during the film festival. He feels quite at home, in other words, which is not surprising, given that it's essentially a Western saloon with chaps in German uniforms instead of chaps. They've only had a couple of sips when Burton leaves Eastwood at the bar, sits down with some German officers, grabs the dirndl-clad waitress and plonks her down in his lap. He whistles a song at her, code, and whispers, though it's still an order, it's a whispered order, to meet him in the woodshed. Then he tells her, it's another order, to slap him across the face, which she does with some gusto, before flouncing off convincingly. The other German officers at the table are not impressed by this display of grab-ass boorishness, so Burton puts them in their place by telling them that he's Himmler's brother, which roughly translates as saying that he's a bigger star than any of them, earns the kind of money a bunch of extras could only dream of, and, most importantly, could drink the lot of them under this very table any night of the week. Back at the bar, he and Eastwood inhale a couple of cognacs before Burton slips off to the woodshed, leaving Eastwood to keep an eye on things, i.e. to squint. But remember, he's not just squinting, he's squinting in German. In the woodshed, it's not the barman waiting for boorish Burton, it's Mary Yore, whom he promptly tells to take off her clothes. She's surprised but not unwilling, ready to obey, maybe even turned on somewhat by his German uniform in a fascinating fascism or night porterish way. But he doesn't want to get in her pants, he wants to get into the castle. Helping Mary off with her boots, though even help comes in the form of an order. Give me that boot, he says. He explains that the plane with General Carnaby aboard wasn't shot down, it crash-landed, riddled with bullet holes. British bullets, but a hole is a hole is a hole, he says, in a theatrical triple entendre. And General Carnaby is not really General Carnaby. The person they think is General Carnaby knows no more about the second front than Burton knows about the back end of the moon. Oh, what a shame he didn't say backside instead of back end. By association, then, it's obvious he's got more on his mind than the mission as he helps her take off the other boot and explains that the person being held prisoner is an ex-actor, Cartwright Jones, probably second-rate, playing the role of General Carnaby. Suddenly, things have all got rather meta, especially since it's actually Robert Beatty who's playing the role of the actor, Cartwright Jones, playing the part of Carnaby. He didn't need to be talked into it, Burton explains. He volunteered. What actor wouldn't? Well, One who didn't have Burton's enormous need for money might have thought twice, but yes, in many ways it's a method actor's dream, an opportunity for immersion in character so total that it's highly likely he'll not make it out of the Schloss Adler alive. As Burton says, it might be a short engagement. A one-night stand, says the ever-hopeful Mary. Someone else is coming in. It's Heidi. It's Ingrid Pitt, the barmaid. But any hopes that were in for a Bavarian-themed threesome are quickly dispelled by bossy Burton, who explains that she's going to get Mary into the castle. She's not just a barmaid. She's a top German agent. And, as Burton says, while giving her dirndl-enhanced rack an appreciative leer, what a disguise. A year later, after the publication of The Female Eunuch, Heidi might react differently, but for now she beams as if this compliment is the fulfillment of all her ambitions and hopes as spy, actress, and woman. It's been a wonderful interlude, a combination of Frankie Howard and something like Carry On Up the Schloss Adler, all done in impeccable high thespian style. Unfortunately, Burton has to leave the chill-out shed with its untapped erotic potential and get back to his mates who are still boozing it up in the beer cellar. Great. Oh, perfectly timed. Wow, lucky. Phew. Now, just as there is no end to history, so those aircraft models that we made didn't suddenly cease production with the Second World War, nor was Action Man, or G.I. Joe, demobbed in 1945. No, he continued services as a jet pilot, and the aircraft models made by Airfix continued on flying missions on carrier-borne Phantoms well into the Vietnam era. So when about 5 years ago I was asked if there was any place I'd like to be, any institution where I'd like to be a writer in residence, I didn't hesitate to say an American aircraft carrier. I didn't say the International Space Station because that seemed out of the question, but then the carrier also seemed unlikely, but extraordinarily, after about 6 months of saying, yeah, if you can get me on an aircraft carrier, that would be great, I got a call saying, yep, it's done, you're on. When do you want to fly to the US base in Bahrain? So it happened. And the deal was this. The deal was that a series of books had been planned whereby a writer and a photographer from the Magnum agency would spend time at a particular institution, in my case the USS George H.W. Bush, and then write a very short book of 30,000 words about the experience. So I spent a couple of weeks on the George H.W. Bush in the Arabian Gulf. It was amazing. I was disappointingly chaperoned all the time, and I thought, oh yes, I know why this is. They don't want me to see what's going on. They don't want me to see the kind of brig where they're torturing Al-Qaeda suspects. But actually the truth is I absolutely had to have a chaperone at all times, partly because it's very, very dangerous, especially on the flight deck, where of course I wanted to spend as much time as possible. And living the Airfix dream, as it were. I mean, here am I, there he is. There's the real-life action man. But the other problem is I needed a chaperone because the ship is really so huge. It's highly likely that if I hadn't been escorted, I'd probably still be wandering around this ship looking for the exit. In some ways, it was a rather boring book to write because for me, my writing has always been about finding out about a subject as I go along. But in this case, I'd had the experience on the aircraft carrier. What was it like? It was great. And then I knew pretty much what I made of that experience. And then what remained was a kind of transcription. It was only a bit later in the writing process that I was able to put more of a sort of spin on things. And then I was worried I wouldn't have enough to say, so because I had to write 35,000 words, I wrote 70,000 words, thinking it was best to have twice as much so I could cut them down. And then in a way that will be familiar to all of you who are writers, I became strangely attached to those 70,000 and could only bear to cut 5. Fortunately, the rest of the series didn't happen, so this book, which was meant to be part of a series of 35,000 words, became a book on its own by me of about 65,000 words. And, I mean, I'll just say something quickly about what went on. I think part of the interest of the project really was the encounter, if you like, between this institution, this warship, where discipline had to be, you know, quite stringently maintained, and the weird self-discipline of somebody like me who's very unused to taking orders from anyone. I mean, my version of self-discipline is almost indistinguishable from a form of self-indulgence, actually. And I'll just say a few more things about the about my experience on the aircraft. It began, I got an email saying that it was great. I'd have a rather privileged sort of living quarters. I'd only be sharing a room with 5 other officers. To which I replied, no, 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 I've got to have a room of my own. Whereupon the Navy wrote back and said to my mediators, he's got to understand, nobody has a room on their own except the captain. And I said, well, you've got to understand there's several things. I'll be typing at night and it'll keep these other people awake. He said, it's an aircraft carrier, the noise on it of aircrafts taking off and landing, nobody's going to notice you're typing. So I say, oh, well, I've got terrible prostate trouble. I'll be kind of peeing 5 times a night or something. And then I just came out and said it honestly. The truth is I'm an only child. I don't have any brothers or sisters. I'm just incapable of sharing. I mean, it just filled me with horror. And what particularly filled me with horror was sharing a room with 5 people. It would have been even worse to have shared a room with 1 person. I'd rather, if you like, have shared a room with 200, because then the other physical presence would have been sort of diluted. Anyway, I resigned myself to sharing a room with a photographer and these 4 other officers. And then something rather wonderful happened. We got on the ship and they took me to my own room, the vice presidential suite. It was just so great. Effectively, I'd taken on the whole might of the US Navy and had won. The title of the book is Another Great Day at Sea, and it has that title because every day the captain would address the whole crew of 5,000 people, and everything would come to a stop. And it became a great source of amusement. For in the course of this 7-month deployment, every day he'd say something like, well, it's been another great day at sea. And in a way that seemed peculiarly American to me, each day he'd sort of say something that made us think that this day, this great day at sea, was even greater than the previous one. And this ability to live in the realm of the constantly escalating superlative seems so different to the British thing, you know, when the typical response, if you're British, somebody says, how are you? You say, mustn't grumble, which of course is a form of grumbling itself. And the captain it was a very, very happy ship. He only, things have moved on in the Navy since the days of the Bounty and Captain Bligh keel-hauling people. The discipline is absolute, but one of the ways in which you keep people happy on a ship, of course, is by, I got on really well with everybody because everybody had a sense of humor. You've got to be when there's 5,000 people crowded together. I mean, the aircraft carrier is huge. A journalist who'd been on a carrier before me, he had been caught fiddling his expenses. He was claiming taxi fares when they knew he was on board an aircraft carrier. So the editor had him banged to rights, as we say in England, but the journalist rather brilliantly wrote back and said, have you seen the size of these things? The aircraft carrier is huge, but it's as crowded as a Bombay slum. I thought there'd be badminton courts, maybe even a tennis court, but there's really no room at all. You really have to keep people happy. And one of the things I'm conscious of, one of the reasons I love being in America is just the incredible politeness of American life. But I've never been anywhere as polite as the aircraft carrier. And it was just this beautiful experience of courtesy, really. And that's one of the things that, of course, makes life on the carrier better. The other thing, which is so significant, 1/5 of the crew were women, and of course that proportion is going up all the time. And there'd of course been huge opposition to having women in combat ships. And then it was when they finally did allow women on, the reaction was very similar to what it was at my Oxford College, where we'd successfully excluded women for about 600 years or something. When they finally let women on, the reaction was, why didn't we do that 50 years ago? And it was a real illustration to me that so many of the world's big and small problems can be solved by the simplest of expedients, just having women around. And it just wasn't all the things they thought would be an issue. It just wasn't a problem at all. It just wasn't an issue. Although, I mean, one of the guys I spoke to said, yeah, the main effect of having women on board was that the ship smelled better because the guys showered more often. And it was just wonderful, really. The captain of the ship, there was this incredible bit, really. I mean, everything about the Navy's sort of recruitment policy was so impressive. At one point, the sort of rear vice admiral of the whole fleet in that part of the world came on board, and she, Nora Tyson, effectively outranked the captain, and she was amazing. You know, she was an English major. And it was just so not what I'd expected at all. You know, Nora Tyson was great. You know, there was a great bit when she, anyway, I mean, she was just wonderful. And the truth is, a lot of the crew were people they were from parts of America that I'd not experienced before, the Bible Belt, essentially. Many of them were very evangelical, right-wing Christians. But even though I disagreed with their politics, I just admired each and every one of them. They were so young. They were typically 18, 19, about the age I was at college. Now, I don't know about you. What did you do at college? I reckon you smoked pot and drank a lot of beer, if you're anything like I was. And there's these 18, 19-year-old kids with no education at all doing these incredibly demanding jobs. They were so young that I started to feel really old. And there was this one great moment when I finally saw sort of like a ghostly figure, somebody older than me. And there he was, the dentist. I kept wanting to find an excuse to interview him. And all I really wanted to say to him was, hey, old timer, what's it like to be so old? Because he was the only person on the ship older than me. Finally, though, I should add, just right at the end, this was a phase of my reading life when I was really spending much less time reading fiction, novels. In the aftermath of the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a certain amount of debate. You know, when is the great novel? When is the contemporary version of The Naked and the Dead going to emerge from these recent wars? But actually, the truth is, there was no need for a great novel to emerge because so much great literature has emerged from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, but not in the form of novels, but in that incredible high-quality reportage that you've come across in those amazing books by, there's so many of them, Dexter Filkins, David Finkel. And I was really finding that I was admiring these reporters who were coming up with this high-quality literature that was also factually accurate, that often had a great sort of stylistic panache, and they were often doing this in the face of danger that was real and immediate. So I loved all this stuff, and this was, I started to really I started to revere reporters, and this was my chance to be a kind of reporter. And I am going to have to end on a slightly negative English note. At the end of this experience, when I'd finished writing the book, several things. One, it was okay for Joan Didion to say, I'm so small, so neurotically inarticulate that people just don't notice me. I become invisible. Well, I can't be invisible because I'm this long, lanky thing that's always sort of, people can see me lurking around, never more so than when I'm trying to be inconspicuous. So that form of reporting wasn't available to me. But actually, I also discovered that really of all the kind of reporters, all the kind of writers, I'm not. Being a reporter was absolutely top of the list. So I really recommend this to you as a really inspirational work of the failure of the author as reporter. Thank you so much for listening to me.